So the part of this that everybody's always interested in, I mean, we have to lay the groundwork. We have to talk about how penalties are calculated because, we at least got to stop and say, okay, is this right? Because if it's not right, we already have an easy fix. Okay, so it's right and the client messed up. What do we do? Here's where everybody always wants to know, what are my options? And this one is kind of what we call the low-hanging fruit. It's an easy one to obtain for the most part if they qualify. It's something called the First-Time Penalty Abate program. So the First-Time Penalty Abate, they actually changed the name for whatever reason. It used to be First-Time Penalty Abatement, and they changed the name now just to be fun. But it's available for only 3 penalty types. These are the ones we covered a little bit earlier: failure to file, failure to pay, and failure to deposit. So if it's one of those 3 penalty types, great. You've already marked off one thing on the list to see that they're eligible for this. So what could that look like? What are some examples of eligible penalties for the First-Time Abate program? Let's say somebody who files on time but they owe, and they filed maybe even April 1st as an individual. They owe but they don't make the payment, and April 15th passes, they're going to get a failure to pay. They file late, and whether they make a payment then or not, they're going to get hit with both. So you can have more than one, but it's only these 3 types. If they file late and make no payment, or they're audited and additional tax is assessed, or they don't file at all, they can be having something called a SFR, a substitute for return prepared. Those are going to layer in some penalties for failing to file and failing to pay. All these are examples where it could qualify, but then we say, okay, let's think about this and see if it's really what we want to pursue. We know it's one of those 3 types, but what are these requirements? Now, a little bit of a change in this program that happened in recent months is they truly tightened down on this to where it is a one-time only. It is a one-time in the lifetime of that taxpayer only. So one time if it's a corporation only, one time for an individual in their lifetime, and they actually tag it that way so they don't ever get this again. So look and make sure, is this really their best option so that we're not using their get out of jail free card and this maybe it's a small penalty. So what are the requirements? The tax period has to be after the year 2001, so January 1st, 2001 or after. So that's one of the first requirements. We can't get this FTA, this penalty abatement for anything prior to 2001 anymore. They have to be in compliance, so that means they filed all the required returns. They don't have any missing returns at this moment. And if they owe money, they have to have an arranged payment. I recently answered that question for an accountant that contacted me and said, I'm having trouble with the first-time abatement, and it's because they had an amount owing, they didn't make a payment arrangement. You can't qualify. So it has to be that they're in an installment agreement, or you can get an extension of time to pay, but beware that that is still a contract, and they're going to expect a payment for all of that taxpayer's balance owing within that 120 days extension. So bottom line, you got to have an arranged payment if they owe. They're in compliance and it's after 2001. So we can check these off as we go. Then we're starting to see they're eligible. What if they don't owe anything? Well, that's still possible. You can get a first-time abatement for somebody that doesn't owe anything, but they have to have made a payment against any balances within the past 2 years. It's called the refund statute expiration date. If we have some payments that have been made within the past couple of years, we have the eligibility to get some of that refund back as it is possible. So sometimes you'll hear from the agents, oh, you got to pay that before we're allowed to look at any abatement options. And that's not true. As long as you meet these requirements, you could be eligible for it. The next part of this is 3 years prior to that date have to also be clean. So let's say you were going back to the year 2001 because you know it's an eligible year. That means in the year 2000 and in 1999 and 1998, there are no failure to file, failure to pay, failure to deposit. None of those exist. In fact, they've tightened down on that as well. It literally has to be 0. If there's even 1 cent of any of those type of penalties, they will not be eligible. So make sure and check the transcripts, double check that all 3 years are clean prior to the year you want to request. And if they are, great to go. Here's that one occasion that I promised you that I would tell you later how an estimated penalty is a little different. If they have no failure to pay, no failure to deposit, no failure to file, none of those bad things, but they happen to have an estimated tax penalty, they're okay. Because an estimated tax penalty is basically interest, it's not going to be a black mark against them. They would still be eligible for this program. So how do you go about making sure that they're clean? You're going to want to get a transcript. You're going to want to study that transcript. And how do you go about that? Well, the taxpayer can get their own transcript, or others can get it on their behalf. Anyone enrolled in IRS e-services can pull a transcript using just an 8821 form. If you are a Circular 230 practitioner, so that is your enrolled agent or CPA or attorney, you can pull it with either one, the 8821 or the 2848. The 2848 is the power of attorney. 8821 is just an information request. But what dates do you want to put on there? Now, I will always put older dates, and you go, well, why would you go back so far? That's kind of silly. 1990 through 2021 is what I put on mine. You can go 3 years into the future from the current date, and you can go all the way back to 1990. I like it because I can kind of see what somebody's compliance is. And maybe not all that data is in there, but at the absolute minimum, if you want to look for transcript opportunities for 2001, you got to put at least 1998 on there. The reason being, if your power of attorney does not cover the years of just the look back, so 2001, you have a 3-year look back to double check and make sure there's no penalties, they can't get you the first time abatement because your power of attorney doesn't cover all the years you would need to. So that's a thought for you. Another thought is, even though taxpayers can actually pull their own transcripts, it's limited. Or if you call up on the phone, it's limited. You can only go back and get 10 transcripts. You can only go back 10 years. So they may not be able to get the full benefit because remember, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for the client. If you have a really great penalty, you can get abated for the year 2002, say, and you don't have it covered, you aren't ever going to know about it, and you may give them a penalty that's much smaller than what their opportunity could be. So how do you get transcripts? You can call the IRS. You can request that they fax them or mail a copy. For practitioners only, you can call the practitioner priority line, and there's the number here in your slide. Or if you want to go through e-services, or if you want some help setting up e-services or have any trouble, again, practitioners only, the e-help desk is also listed here on your slide. My recommendation, I use e-services to pull the transcripts. It's a little bit of setup. It's not terrible, certainly. And you can then either store transcripts in the e-services mailbox to view and print and download and import them into Excel. You can perform Excel searches that way for codes, or even better, you bring it into a commercial software. Canopy's tool, for example, will take all that information out of e-services, bring it in, and then analyze it for reports, because I cannot tell you the time saver that is, but the bottom line, look at those transcripts so you can see the best first-time abate opportunity. Because if you are not doing that properly, you're going to be doing a huge disservice and maybe getting, let's just say, oh, I see right here you can get, $1,000 penalty abated. Yay, your client's super happy. But then you don't realize that 15 years before, maybe it's a $20,000 abatement. I mean, you just really have to double check and make sure you're not squashing their one chance, their one golden opportunity. So you'll see in here also that we have, if you just look at what Canopy is able to do for that, please definitely check it out, because time is one of the things we don't get much of, and to have a time-saving device right there is absolutely tremendous. So definitely look to see what options you have, but don't go into trying to request a first-time abatement without pulling transcripts, because you want to make sure that they meet all the eligibility before you ever ask for that. And to say, okay, well, what if I did want to do this by hand? How in the world do I do this? Well, how you analyze that transcript, there's always a 3-digit code. It's like a processing code that they assign. Each of them has their own unique numbers there. So your failure to file is a code 166, failure to pay code 276. You go through and you're going to look for that code every single year for the taxpayer. So we know failure to pay, because it's a 0.5% per month. It can go for 50 months. There could be a lot of those in that tax year. So you got to add them all together and figure out how much total failure to pay. Add all your 166s together, find out how much failure to file, and so forth. And then you're going to compare all those different years across the board and say, okay, which one is my better one? Just to make things a little more interesting, be aware that a partial removal can complicate things a little bit, because let's say you had a omitted return, or you filed a return to replace a substitute for return. Well, ultimately, you're changing your base amount of tax, so they have to recalculate the penalty, because penalty is a percentage of tax owing. Then it'll show a reduced or removed penalty, but it's kind of like a false positive. It's not really removed, they just reduced it because your tax changed. So those code numbers, 161 means a reduced or removed failure to file. 271 is a reduce, remove, failure to pay. And then we have this really cool little code that can happen. 197, reduce or removed interest. Well, wait a second. Interest is statutory, meaning it's by order of law. We can't ever ask for interest to come back. But because it's a calculated amount, if your tax is reduced and your penalty is reduced and your interest is calculated as a percentage of penalties and tax, then it's reduced. That's the only way that your interest can be removed, is recalculating your tax. But I love that code. I like a code 197 when we can get it. So from there, how do we contact the IRS? How do we go about getting a first-time abatement for somebody? Well, as a practitioner, you have to make sure you have power of attorney. You can't request it with just an information form. So power of attorney, form 2848. That is for your CPAs, attorneys, and enrolled agents. Those are the circular 230 is what they call them, practitioners that are allowed to do this. You have to have a power of attorney because you're asking to do something on behalf of a client. Make sure that your year that you want to request the first-time abatement is on the power of attorney and those 3 years prior. So if it's a 2001 first-time abate request, make sure you have 99 and 98 and 97, 2000 and 99 and 98 all on the list. That's all covered on your power of attorney. So you can call in. I like to call in because I get an instant answer. And as long as you meet the eligibility, they can give you an instant answer. I love that. Or you can write to the IRS. That's okay too. Or if you're not a Circular 230 practitioner, you can help your taxpayer to do this for themselves. If you want to call the IRS, you as a practitioner can call the practitioner priority line. If it's your taxpayer calling, they have to call the general line. It's the one we get a little bit of the hold time on, but that's the 800 tax 1040 line. Or, and this was a fun thing. A couple years ago, they released what they called the penalty assistance line, which is an 800 number with an extension, specifically extension number 225. I checked it out again. I haven't seen them publish it ever since. It still is active. It's still alive, and it will still get you somebody that can help. And this is available to a practitioner or to, their taxpayer, but they don't publish this anymore. As far as I know, this is still good, so use it. And in a future update, if it turns out they don't want us to anymore, then we'll pass that along. But so far, these are all available. Practitioner priority service, I see maybe 10-minute hold times. The penalty assistance line number about the same, and only the general line that we see quite a few hours hold time. So that's kind of some little tidbits of information there. What do you do when you call them? You're going to ask for a first-time abatement. And be very specific. We don't want them to go rooting around trying to figure out, okay, which one are we wanting to do? If you just say, I'm calling for first-time abate, well, be specific. So I may call and it may sound like I'm calling to request a first-time abate for my client for the 2002 tax year. Okay, they know exactly what I'm asking for. They're going to go into the RCA software, and there are instructions that go right through the Internal Revenue Manual that tell them how to go through and run all these. And they're going to say, okay, we see that they're in compliance. They're going to go through those same checklists that we know already they qualify for because we did our work ahead of time. The nice thing is this software does that check very quickly, and you'll receive your answer almost immediately. So most of these calls for me take just a few minutes. When I get on the line with an agent, they're going to go through kind of a script with you and say, okay, you're going to receive this letter number 3503C. It's based on your good history, timely filing and paying. And the nice thing is that it will reduce the interest. Now, when you're on the call, they can't really calculate it at that moment. They can tell you how much a penalty is being abated, but you know that the interest is going to be recalculated and it will produce less interest, but they just normally can't tell you right there on the call. So that's a little bit of a tidbit of how that works. And it's always exciting to be able to call up and get an answer and help your client within just a few minutes of getting somebody on the line. So this is the reason I do most of them on the phone. And there is not a limit, as weird as it is, for calling on a first-time abatement, because these are administrative procedures. There are limits for calling in and requesting dollar limits for other things that we'll talk about in a moment, but not for the first-time abatement. So go forward. If you know somebody qualifies, make sure you go through that checklist that we gave you earlier in the slides and make sure each one of those is met and make sure it really is the best thing for the client at that moment. It is a one-time option, so be careful on the timing. If they still owe and you get the abatement right now, then new penalties are going to keep racking up as they owe. So maybe just watch your timing would be the recommendation.